in terms of HR, if we boil it down, what are the concerns that are related that they have? And really, we've boiled that down into 4 key buckets, if you will. Diversity, inclusion, self-understood. Employee well-being, employee engagement, and change management. I mentioned just a minute ago about new employees, and they've never really been connected from a culture perspective to their peer groups, maybe to their bosses' peer groups. And that really has an impact on change management. I'd like to get a better handle from your guys' perspective on these other pieces: well-being, engagement, diversity, and inclusion, and what that means in terms of our own experiences. Right. So let me go to Daniel.
Yeah, I was actually champing at the bit here because I was just before this call, actually, I was having a conversation with our chief DEI officer around change management initiatives. And one of the things that she brought to our attention, and it's something that we had thought about, but it's very true. None of this is going to be successful. None of it matters if your culture doesn't support it, right? So you have to start with, do you have a culture that supports your employees and that supports people, supports diversity and supports equal experiences? So that's one thing that we've seen from a lot of companies, is that they have actually shifted, or they've been able to free up and really focus on how to grow their culture and try to embrace some of these differences moving forward. But there are still some people hanging on to this idea that, nope, our management has things right. They expect their people to be here 4 days a week. And we don't really need to, we need to think about the minimal amount of change to get there. And that might be right for their company. But I think what that does not do is it doesn't support a new way of working. You're assuming that you have it all nailed down. And so it's not necessarily inclusive or inviting diversity. You're also not thinking about the well-being of your employees. You're saying that you don't trust them, essentially. If you say, nope, if you're not in front of me, I don't believe that you're doing work and I can't manage these projects. So I think that, there's a huge component of HR really having to push the culture, and those of us in workplace strategy trying to push the culture. And we'll get into this later as well. There are ways to measure effectiveness and measure innovation and measure well-being, and also to measure kind of how people are interacting with each other and growing new connections without having to physically see it in front of you in person. So that's not to say that the in-person component, as I've said several times now, isn't important. It's just not the be-all, end-all.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
I would say too, though, Daniel, that from my perspective, it would just seem to me that we've had a year. You would think that you would have a good indicator, or at least companies would have a good indicator that, gee whiz, we've been very less productive or more productive, or we've been remote for an entire year. So to the extent that you would want to, or you could see companies kind of jump into we don't have to do anything differently, we're going to go back to the way it was. I would hope that they are having those hard conversations around, well, we weren't doing it all that great before. Let's talk about making it better. And I think that's where they've got to get challenged in terms of their thinking as a company as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that is a huge component of change management too, is that it's not just, oh, we're making a change and now you all need to be on board. It is about bringing people along through the evolution of what's happening in your company and making sure that you recognize that everybody that's affected is a stakeholder and involving them in the process.
Yeah.
And I like I said, most companies are having these difficult conversations. It's just, I'm surprised by some of the companies that have started to teeter in the right direction and then have said, nope, we're closing the door on that. This is just not for us.
Let me take another step in this conversation and get a little bit deeper into this, right? And we've said this, I think, very well. Both Mike and Daniel have brought this topic up. How do we measure these things? And I think there's 2 core components here. But David, I think, has presented us with a great segue. And his question is, or statement is, what are your views on improving the situation where remote-based employees feel invisible to senior leaders, and are they missing out on the best projects and promotions? I think, Mike, let me give a little preface here, and then I'm going to go to you for this. There's 2 notions here that to start your journey on gaining the insights that you need to help HR use workplace as a tool. One of those is organizational network analysis, and that term becomes a bit more familiar on the HR side. And ultimately, it's a way to help the organization understand their communication capabilities, their ties with others. There's two ways to get that. There's sort of a digital survey component, which is a really cool point in time that helps inform workplace strategy. And there's another way to get to that, and it's 360-degree views that are at the end of every meeting. Now, that sounds a little laborious. It's not. It's about 3 to 4 questions at the end of every meeting. You ask everyone to rate the other participants. And from that, you can get some amazing insights into what's happening with team cohesion and literally hundreds of key points that are happening from an HR perspective. Now, if you sliced it that way, you understand what's happening from an organizational perspective and your strong ties and who's having the right conversations and who's being included in these conversations, you're also able to look at a point in time to figure out, were they mostly in office or were they mostly hybrid? And you can then start defining your resources, your people within the organization that would benefit most from being in the office. You start seeing outliers that maybe are becoming disconnected or that are maybe aren't contributing the best to the team, or at least they're being seen that they're not being the best contributors to the team from a meeting perspective. And you'll then be able to put some soft initiatives in place to help them re-engage with their team. But Mike, let me go to you and maybe help unpack this slide a little bit more.
Yeah, I would say that, part of what we've, thought about here was kind of where could be a good starting point, right? I mean, do you necessarily need to do the O&A first and move on to then deploying some level of either gaining the data going forward about what your utilization information or sensor data was telling you, or do you just go ahead and deploy that? I think what we've kind of looked at here is, you can do both. You can do both relatively quickly, right? I mean, there's not anything standing in the way of being able to accomplish something like this in 6 to 8 weeks. And I think that's what was compelling to me, because obviously I spent a lot of time making sure that as we brought technology to corporate real estate, that we were thinking about how do you get it deployed and how do you get it deployed quickly, so this way that data can be useful. And so I think when you start thinking about both those things, you do have to kind of keep them in front of you, because I think the O&A, all of O&A is going to be something that is interesting, but it takes a little bit too long unless you were able to do something along the lines of what you just mentioned.